estimated, and of course there's room for review, estimated net migration to the UK stood at a provisional 431,000 in the year to December of last year, December 2024, which is down 50% from the year to December 2023. It is, and it is the largest numerical drop on record. The largest numerical drop since records began. And it's only 4 minutes after 10, and you know how it works. I often come on air without knowing where we're going to be at 10:15, let alone 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But I'm already wondering whether it matters a jot to the overweening narrative. I'm already wondering. For a couple of reasons. Some of them obvious, some of them perhaps less so. One of the more obvious reasons is that, listen, if I framed the question in this way, I suddenly realised how arrogant it would make me sound. So I did a trail that would ordinarily play out at about 9:45, just, in the final, the closing quarter of Nick's show. You know how, if you listen, you've heard it before. But because David Gauke was in the studio, very impressive politician, David Gauke. But because he was in the studio, they dropped the adverts, which meant they didn't play my little trail. But my little trail would have said something like this. I've been telling you for months that net migration was about to halve. How on earth could 9 out of 10 people have not been expecting it to, which is what the latest polling tells us. And I suddenly realised, as Eleanor began to prepare the trail that was never played, I suddenly realised that makes it sound like I think everybody in the entire country is listening to my burblings every morning, which would be a position, even by my standards, of quite epic conceit. But it does actually raise the question of how on earth could more people not know? How on earth could more people not know that net migration was set to fall by about a half? Something I've been telling you, I've been hitting you over the head with this, because the numbers are generally available. They are not hard to find. Why would nobody bother to look? Answer, because there's a lot more, quotes, fun, end quotes, to be had, whipping up hatred about migration in general and asylum seekers in particular, to the point where the last call on Nick's show was joining in right-wing media's attempts to turn a woman who publicly called for a pogrom into some sort of folk hero or cause célèbre. The narrative about immigration, in other words, has often, but not always, been completely at odds with the reality. And that is why, at risk of being part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution, I find myself wondering whether it will matter a jot. I really do. Those are the figures. Those are the numbers. Some people... How do you think the immigration obsessives will respond to these numbers? Do you think they'll respond by claiming that it was... that it's all false, that it's not true? By pointing at the relatively tiny proportion of migration that comes over the English Channel irregularly, shouting about that instead of the overall totals, the actual numbers, accuse them of lying or accuse them of embellishment. I don't trust the figures. I don't trust them. Did you trust them when they were really, really high? Yes. Do you trust them now they've halved? No. Okay, what does that tell us about you? I've no idea, but I suspect that you're limbering up for a spell in Idiot's Corner. And I suspect today that Idiot's Corner is going to be rather busy, so much so I'm going to pause my inbox to see how it goes. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. So 431,000, down almost 300,000 on the previous figure, the 6-month figure of 728, and down 50%, give or take, on the previous year. 8 minutes after 10. I don't know. I'm not celebrating these numbers, by the way. I want to make that absolutely clear. People who wish that the conversation around immigration was less toxic and less racist are not by any stretch of the imagination suggesting that we can accommodate 10 million people a year or 2 million people a year or even 1 million people a year in net totals. It's another a very clever play that's used by immigration obsessives to claim that anybody who suggests that the problems of the average person in this country are more likely caused by plutocrats, oligarchs, the distribution of wealth and the collapse of workers' rights and trade unions than they are by your colleague who happens to have come here from Poland or Pakistan. Those of us who are actually committed to the ordinary working people of the UK to the extent that we want them to know the truth about the country that they live in, as opposed to the often jingoistic lies, are very easily portrayed as naive or as dangerous or as part of the problem. What would you do? What would you do if you owned a right-wing newspaper and there was someone popping up every now and then saying, do you know what? I think the people with 10 country estates might have more to do with the housing problems in this country than your neighbour from Poland or Pakistan. You'd want to shut them down, right? How are you going to shut them down if all they do is tell the truth? Well, you have to portray them as something that they're not. So you can see it everywhere. Why do you think Gary Lineker became public enemy number one long before his regrettable social media conduct last week? Because he spoke up for people who value the truth, because he spoke up for people who were being pilloried and condemned and blamed for problems caused by entirely different people. Here go the figures. Here they are. Net migration is down by 50%. There'll be people on the left who actually that's not true. That's a lazy breakdown, isn't it? There's plenty of people on the right who aren't obsessed with immigration. Plenty of people on the right who are perfectly comfortable with the distribution of wealth in this country, but don't like the way that foreign-born folk get pilloried for it or get scapegoated for other problems. You might want to see increased funding to the NHS. It doesn't mean that you want to throw people out who weren't born here, but loosely speaking, left has come to mean opposed to racism or opposed to immigration obsession, and right has come to mean, or far right certainly, has come to mean can't really talk about anything else and don't care about the facts. So there'll be people on the left pointing out that these numbers possibly render a lot of what Keir Starmer has done in recent days unnecessary. A lot of the unpleasantness contained within his words, if not necessarily his policies, about an island of strangers. And what was the adjective he used to describe the episode? It wasn't toxic, pungent. I can't remember. I do apologise. But the language was ultimately quite troubling, very troubling for some of us. And the argument that he didn't need to do that because he knew this was on the horizon is quite powerful. The other argument, of course, is that he did it very deliberately because, like anybody who's been paying attention, and I can tell you for a fact, there's plenty of people in my profession who've been as surprised by these numbers as many people who don't get paid to pay attention to the news. He knew these numbers were coming and has positioned himself as committed to a reduction in immigration shortly before the biggest reduction in net migration on record has been announced. It's extraordinary, isn't it? I'm sure, writes Adam, that the usual grifters are lining up to blame Labour for the drop in net migration. They've made such a mess of the country that nobody wants to come here. I don't think they will, mate, because they're on a hiding to nothing if they do. They've spent their entire lives calling for epic drops in net migration, and now they've got one. I wonder how big a factor that is. This is one of my pet subjects. As you look at the breakdown of numbers, and you know, and you certainly don't need me to tell you, that the Hong Kong and Ukraine influxes, welcoming refugees, if they are the right type of refugee, of course, in this country, has contributed to the recent spikes. You will also know that Tory policies introduced by Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly will be largely responsible for a fairly hefty reduction in the number of dependents that are accompanying people when they come here to work. I think that's probably standing at around the 35% mark. And the difference between the number of people moving to the UK and leaving the country is also driven by relatively high numbers of people leaving the country. And the bit I sometimes wonder about, squalid was the word I was looking for, thank you. The bit I was interested in is how attractive a country it's become. Is it half as attractive now to people who want to come here to work and study than it was a year ago? Have we made Brexit Britain 50% less attractive to people who've got actual choices, people who have got options about where they work or where they study, people who can choose which country, if not their own, that they want to pay tax in or pay tuition fees. And we have somehow achieved the extraordinary result of making ourselves 50% less attractive to those people. I don't know. And I don't know how you would ever be able to measure it. Emigration's up 11%, 517,000 people leaving the country. I'd quite like to do a phone-in, if not today, then at some point, about why are you leaving this country. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to reach the 517,000 who left last year. Doing a phone-in in the UK, asking people who've left the UK to ring in and talk to me would be a little bit like that time I almost did a phone-in about what it's like not to have a phone. I got halfway through the invitation to ring in and tell me what it's like to not have a phone before I realised that was possibly not the finest topic in the history of phone-in radio. But asking 517,000 people who've left the country to give me a ring in this country and tell me why. I know there's loads of people listening overseas, but you take my point. I have two problems now. The first is that historically, stories that I am telling you about for the first time, stories that haven't had 24 hours to percolate through your consciousness, to prick your thinking, to pique your interest, stories that I know some people in this business who can't talk about a story until they've seen it through the lens of Daily Mail coverage. But you struggle sometimes to respond to things that you're hearing about for the first time. I don't mean that rudely. I do too. You know, my ducks would be in more of a row on this issue at 10 o'clock tomorrow than they are now because the numbers only dropped 10 minutes ago. And I knew they were coming. So goodness knows what it's like to process this information if you didn't know they were coming, if you weren't expecting this historic fall. And Starmer, of course, promises that the figures will continue to fall, quotes, significantly over the next 4 years. There's currently no reason to predict that they won't. Whether it's for good or for ill is a different conversation. But my two problems, the first is you haven't had time necessarily to come up with interesting responses and opinions on this. I'm not going to take that one to the bank. I'm going to say, yes, you have. You've had almost as long as me. And of course, if you've been listening recently, these figures won't have come as a surprise to you. So I'm going to back you on this. I'm going to absolutely stake my program on your ability to answer the question I'm about to ask. But the second problem I've got is the problem of counterfactual. The problem that is best summed up by this being, well, I don't think there's much room for doubting the numbers. If you doubt these numbers, then you have to doubt the numbers that got you angry in the first place. But the second problem I've got is looking into a crystal ball. I prefer sometimes questions that are built on detail and observable evidence. Beyond the numbers, we've actually got nothing here. Beyond the numbers themselves, there's not a great deal to analyse and unpick. In fact, my own catchphrase has just come back to haunt me, hasn't it? When I say that's not an opinion, that's counting, it closes down a conversation. Today, we almost want to do it the opposite way round. Today, we've done the counting, now I want the opinions. So I might even end up saying that's not counting, that's an opinion. So here's the question. For whatever reason, and it may be that you are going to be the proof of your own particular pudding on this, for whatever reason, do you think these numbers will make much difference to anything? I'm referring once again to that final call to David Gork just towards the end of Nick's show. Right-wing media now putting almost all of its tanks on the lawn of the justice system in defence of a woman who publicly called for a pogrom when there were raging mobs rampaging through the streets of this country. She encouraged them to set fire to hotels containing asylum seekers. Technically, a pogrom would normally look at ethnic or religious affiliation before being applicable in the context of calls to kill them or calls to burn down their homes. But given that the toxic rhetoric during the Farage riots was almost entirely directed at people perceived as Muslims, I'm comfortable using the word pogrom to describe what that imprisoned woman did in the very crucible of public rioting. So that is part of the narrative of immigration in this country. How can a woman who I read in the Daily Mail is a very model of good citizenship and neighbourly spirit, how can she end up publicly calling for a pogrom? Imagine if she'd said, go and burn all the synagogues, I don't care if that makes me racist. Go and burn all the churches. I don't care if that makes me racist. Go and burn all the mosques. I don't care if that makes me racist. That is a big part of the narrative of immigration in this country. Do the numbers change any of it? I hope they do, because I hate the hate. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Is your Uncle Keith or your Auntie Doris going to stop posting racist memes on Facebook because immigration figures have actually just come down by the largest percentage ever?